So I mentioned normally Naomi and I did this together, and this is actually Naomi's field of expertise, and so I feel bad that she isn't here, so I had to take out a bunch of stuff because I don't understand it. Her real job is she's a professor at Central Washington University. She's the director of the Accessibility Study Program, which is like knowing how to do things to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act and you know, all this kind of stuff. So this is kind of her bailiwick. But this is one of those things where you find things in an archive and it just kind of turns into something else. I found a couple things that talked about, there was a file in the Pullman records at the Newberry Library in Chicago about, called polio cars. And then there was another one that was talking about traffic to the Mayo Clinic or whatever. And so it was kind of like you find bits and pieces. And I went through the official guide collection that Lake States one year and found all this stuff and found the new Rochester Limited and stuff like that. So anyway, we get into this. What they're doing there is you see a picture from Dearborn Street Station in Chicago. You can see there's an Atlantic Coastline car behind it, and you can see they're loading an iron lung into the back of that car out of what looks like the back of a bus, and it actually was kind of like a bus. It was a trailer. It was configured. It was owned by a man that we'll get into, but basically it was like either an oversized fifth wheel, or actually it had a dolly under and a pintle hook to a tractor pulling it. But anyway, they backed it up to the end of the platform. They put down some ramps, and they're going to load it into a Pullman called the San Lucas that we'll talk about later. Okay, oh yeah, first off, probably should have done this on the other one too, but a bunch of people that really gave us information on this. Bob Weber, who is the chief archivist down at the Pullman Library at Union, the IRM down there, some of you know him. David Rose, archivist for the March of Dimes, and which obviously has to do with polio. The folks over at the Railroad Museum in Green Bay, because they actually own one of the cars we're going to be talking about. Tom Madden, who has copied and made available all the car construction records for every heavyweight Pullman sleeper and whatever ever made, and gave me some help on sorting out some of Pullman Company's definitions. They would change things over the years. One division would call it something else, one called this, you know. Bob and Don for you know, answering some of my requests to get stuff out of the archives and putting up with me going through reams of paper at their place. Got a picture from the C&NW, Megan von Isenberg, who's the director of the Duke Medical School Library. They gave me some background on the Mayo brothers and some old hospital cars, and in addition to that, she's my daughter-in-law. And then the reference staff at the Newberry Library in Chicago that has the corporate records for the Pullman Company and also the Burlington and some other things down there. So they would come up with good stuff, and they're great about just send it to them and they found it and sent it back. So anyway, so thank you for all this. Okay, so today we're going to talk about some examples of handling disabled patients, which Naomi knew all the correct words for this. I just call them disabled, but I think we're all old enough that we know what we really mean without knowing the exact official approved words. And so we're going to talk about some purpose-built cars, which were two Pullman sleepers called the Ephraim McDowell and the Joseph Lister, which were built specifically to haul patients from Chicago to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. Then we got some repurposed cars where they just took an old car and modified it a little bit and made it work. In this case, it's going to be one called the San Lucas, which is the one you saw on the cover slide. And then, of course, even the Ferdinand Magellan, the one that was used as the presidential car for Roosevelt and Truman, and I think the last person to use it that I could find documented was Mamie Eisenhower. It was sold off during the Kennedy administration. And then they tried to come up with a way to standardize this when we got into streamliners, so that we could always handle them without going through all these gyrations of designing a new car or trying to reuse an old one. So we'll touch on that a little bit. Now, this is the one thing I thought I could explain that Naomi had. A concept called ableism. In other words, an able-bodied person, or in the days we started this in the 19th century, an able-bodied man. Things were designed for an able-bodied man to do. And so if you had a patient that had problems or whatever and you needed to get them on the train in Baraboo or whatever, you just solved it because it was only going to happen every once in a while, you figured. And so everything was a one-off ad hoc problem. And so it got to be literally till pretty much modern times that people expected disabled people, whether you're blind or deaf or you know, in a wheelchair or whatever, they were never expected to be routine passengers back in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. It was just kind of nobody thought about it. So strategy number one, which goes with the earliest part, what I call the shade tree mechanic approach, is you just used what you had and you did what you needed to. So it wasn't anything elaborate, it wasn't anything particularly smart. So basically what they would do, and think of any the wood cars or the early heavyweight Pullmans, you just took the window out. And then you would, if you had somebody that had to be on a stretcher, you just took the window out. And you hauled them in, and then you laid them across the seats or whatever, and then you screwed them back in. It was basic carpentry. You know, you took out the 8 screws or whatever, took out the window, and you put it back in again. It wasn't tough. I mean, the station agent could do it, or any farmer could do it. And one example that I found was a girl, teenager, named Lucy Gray, and she lived in Waterville, Minnesota, and she had to go, they were sending her to Rochester because she had these aches and pains and the doctor didn't know what to do with it, so they put her on the train by removing the window, and this was like 1875, something like that, and they took her to the Mayo Clinic for an appendectomy, and they got her in there, and basically they did the surgery within like an hour or something. They said if it had been much longer, she'd have been dead. And so this was the example of how they did it. You know, Waterville's not a big city, you know, they just took it out, put her in, started the train up. And there were hospital cars that were built. These are pictures from 1916, 17. I think one of them was an Erie car, and the other one was Central New Jersey. But these were not in regular service. These were like the company used for hauling people, because most of the railroad companies had their own company hospital back in those days. The NP ran their own system of hospitals. They had one in Tacoma, one in St. Paul, whatever. And same thing. So, but basically, if you look at it, it's the same design that was used for Army hospital cars in World War I, Army hospital cars in World War II, a 4-foot wide door to load stretchers in, and then the interior was all just 2 high bunks, and you just lay the litter patients on top. So it was not something that you could use for revenue service, you know, on the Northwestern, for example. So because that wasn't a real answer, somebody decided, well, let's design some new cars. And this actually originated with the management on the Chicago Northwestern. And because, well, let me skip past that one. It was a collaboration, okay? It was between the railroad, Pullman, who built virtually all the passenger cars in those days, and the industry, in this case, the medical industry. So you had the Northwestern, you got Pullman, you got the medics, which in this case is the Mayo Clinic, all working together. They would have meetings together. They even involved the ambulance men at Rochester, saying, you know, how do you need to get these guys on and off? So it was actually pretty forward thinking. And they were worried about having, you know, humane treatment and a little bit of comfort. So the Mayo Clinic had a long history of dealing with the Northwestern, and they liked each other. You know, they could get along with each other. Dr. William Mayo was the original guy, and in like the 1860s, and his 2 sons, Dr. Will and Dr. Charles, they had taken over by the 1920s. And by then they'd built the first high-rise, I think it was 8 or 10-story Mayo Clinic building. It was considered just unbelievably modern for them. But if you look at it, Rochester had 20,000 people. They had 3,000 hotel rooms just because of the Mayo. Now a lot of them were little kind of mom and pop things with maybe 8 or 10 rooms, or what we would call rooming houses or whatever. But same thing, they were doing 5,000 patients, 8,000 to 9,000 telephone calls a day. They had 10 times as many doctors in Rochester as they did in Baltimore, Maryland, which was a whole lot bigger city. So it was the industry of Rochester. It still is to a big extent. And so the rail service, they could either come on the Great Western or they could come on the Northwestern. And the Northwestern was by far the primary hauler. And so the Northwestern wanted to, you know, increase their traffic, and they wanted to protect it from any competition. And so they got figuring out that there were a lot of patients who came in from New York or Atlanta or whatever to go to the Mayo, and they all had to go through Chicago, which meant that they were potential for the Northwestern. And so somebody thought, said, well, we already got a train that goes through there, Chicago to Mankato, and we'll just convert and put a sick room in the lounge car at the back. And so they said, well, let's talk to the to the official guys. And so they talked to Pullman, and literally this is at the president, vice president level. They were up there, and a staff study was done. They came up with about 6 options at Pullman on how to do it. And they came in and they said, okay, we got 5,500 patients a year. We've had 8,000 stretcher patients in the last 5 years. Most of them could use what was called an Arnson stretcher, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. And so you had about 10 a month, though, that required a long stretcher, basically like a gurney, like 8 foot long. And that you couldn't get that through the vestibule doors because you can't make the turn. And so, and they also had wheelchair cases, and Mayo was big on trying to make it easy to get patients. And so they would coordinate with the bus companies, with the railroads. They even started the first airport in Rochester to handle it. And so everybody's working together. The Northwestern even had a tariff put in, a special fare for patients going to Rochester. Discount price, and you had 6 months to use the return. So here we get the Arnson stretcher, like I said. They show them taking a stretcher out of that old car there. These things started around 1915, 16, something like that. And there was a company out of Chicago. And what you needed, though, if you were a stretcher patient, was you had to lie down. I mean, the reason you're on a stretcher is because you can't sit up in a day coach. And you need a little bit of privacy, a little bit of peace, and you need a lavatory. And so most of them are traveling with an attendant, and the attendant needs to be where he can deal with the patient without causing a lot of problems. And you need to get there in good shape for the clinic appointment. The train out of Chicago to Rochester was an overnight train. It was overnight coming back. So, you know, what can you use, and how many people do you think you're going to get? So they started doing some really detailed staff studies on this. And they said, okay, we got 3 options on the train. We can put them in a coach, we can put them in a section, or we can put them somewhere in a lounge car, because you can move furniture in the back of the lounge car, or we could put them in the dining car, you know, like they used to make the dining car crews, just sleep on the floor or sleep on the tables during the night. So what can you do? And notice on the right there, there's the stretcher. You can see it's curved on the ends, and it had the handholds right there in the corners. So that's why they could maneuver it in and out a little bit. So obviously most of us know this. I've shown this to people that don't realize about configurations, but the coach, okay, it's seats, and it's a lab, and it's pretty small. You can't get a stretcher into the bathroom on a coach, and so most of them. So you know that's not a good choice, because you got to lay down, and they're not all set up for that. So okay, here we are looking at a section. Okay, well in the daytime it's seats, at nighttime you convert to beds, but the patient needs to be there during the day, so he's going to have it down, and at night, if you got it drawn up or you got it made up for nighttime, you got the curtains closed. So yeah, you can give them a little privacy, but where's the attendant going to be? If the attendant's in the upper, they got to keep getting up and down that ladder, or you know, hang upside down to talk to them. And or if you put the attendant on the other side of the aisle and the other lower, you've basically lost 2 sections. You've lost 4 berths because you've got one here, but you can't put anybody else in with them. So that's not a particularly good one. So that leaves us the lounge car. And this is a typical 1920s lounge buffet by the looks of it, because there's the waiter in the back. And so yeah, you can move those couches and chairs. They're not bolted to the floor, but there's some problems with that. And this is a direct quote from one of the railroad vice presidents. This is not a place for sick people. And kind of why, it was considered a gentleman's club. I mean, most travelers on these things were like businessmen or whatever. This wasn't a family kind of thing. And the seats in the back there were where you sat while your berths were being converted, and the cars up front. And they would leave Chicago at 7-something at night. They're in there drinking and the radio running and everything until after midnight, So that didn't work. And plus, I love some of the quotes I found, but men's conversation, it was a place to have men's conversation away from the sensibilities of women. So, but anyway, so you got some of the same problems. There's no privacy. It's not an accessible lab. There's no peace. So we come up with the new and improved Rochester, Minnesota special. And the 2 cars we're going to be talking about is the Joseph Lister and the Ephraim McDowell. So from 1930 to 52, those 2 cars were assigned every day to the Chicago to Rochester run. And then they took the cars off in 1953. They decided that You know, they didn't need them anymore. The traffic was so low. And they actually converted them to an 8-section, 4 double bedroom configuration, which was pretty easy, and moved them to Chicago to Green Bay. In '57, they disappeared out of there completely. So the cars were completed middle of the month, June 1930. The end of the month, the first run was made. And the 2 new sleepers, like I said, Plan 4003 Pullman, they were the only 2 ever built to that plan. And they had some unique features, which we'll show in a minute. This Northwestern put out a 30-page booklet advertising about the features of this new train, or 26-page rather. And they really promoted it. I mean, they had posters and they had all kinds of stuff. Whoops, hit the wrong button. And this is some of the stuff I copied out of some of the official guides and everything, but the schedule, which I know is probably impossible to read, but basically northbound, they left Chicago at 8 p.m., got to Rochester at 7:05 in the morning, and then the train kept going to Mankato, but they dropped the cars, the sleepers, at Rochester. And southbound, it left Rochester at 9:10 p.m., got in Chicago at 7:30. And in later years, it was combined with another train with the Minnesota and Black Hills Express, which was the Chicago to Rapid City train. So they were I guess what we call politically correct even back in 1930. So the Northwestern always referred to their patients as Rochester clientele. They never said disabled or sick or whatever. And some of the quotes here are from their brochure, that this train was a sanctuary of rest and pleasant privacy. And it was their ambition to more adequately meet the requirement of Rochester clientele. And they had a special room, which we'll see pictures of. It was the same price as a section burst. Now this is also from the brochure, but this is a picture of Chicago Union, Northwestern Station. And so that you can see the interior of the building, but in the basement, there was also a physician's office and what they call matron's rooms, but they had 3 beds down there for sick people, and they had a place to put your baby in a crib, and they would, you know, let mothers bring their children down there and all that kind of stuff. And so that was part of the whole emphasis that we'll take care of you from the time you get to the terminal in Chicago till the time you get off the train at the Mayo. So here we see the floor plan and one of the exterior shots. If you look, we got standard 8 sections to the left side of the car, then we got a drawing room, that's standard, and then we got 4 special rooms, as they call them, or enclosed sections, depending on the year. The terminology was either they were single bedrooms, or they were double bedrooms, or they were enclosed sections. And then if you see where I got the line, arrows lined up, on the left one, there is one of those 30-inch side doors, but there's a wider aisle between the men's lab on that end and the section, so they could actually come in, jockey it around, and put somebody into the sections if they wanted to, if they were only being carried on a stretcher for ease of loading and unloading. And then you got the other 2 doors which line up exactly with special room C and special room D, which were the handicap room, for lack of a better term. So non-standard features on that sleeper compared to other ones. Okay, each car had part of the equipment list was that they had a stretcher assigned to it. I mean, it was stored up in one of the lockers. They came with roller bearing trucks. They had blocks of rubber in the elliptical springs, in the draft gear, in the springing and the diaphragms, anything to take out squeals and smooth out the movements of the train as it went through crossovers and so forth. It was built with extra insulation in the walls so that passing adjacent trains, it wasn't as noisy. And it had those 3 doors in the side for loading stretcher passengers. And they even kept making modifications the first couple years it was in service. They would regularly got reports from the conductors on the run saying, you know, this happened, or we should maybe consider this, or the ambulance men would say, we're still having a problem loading stretchers. It takes us 8 guys to get it up through the side door or whatever. How are we going to work this? And so they kept making modifications, a couple of which we'll talk about. Other things, each of the rooms had a rug in it. They had an extra electric outlet to run to a heat pad into the mattress. They came with Simmons box coil spring mattresses in those fixed beds in the special rooms. And it was a 2'8" by 6'4" bed. I mean, it worked for me. And the special room doors from the hallway, from the aisle, were actually wider, and the room was wider than a standard Pullman room. So they were actually bigger than the drawing room next to it, almost. And then eventually they put in a fold, I guess is the way I termed it, but they decided they were still having a little clearance problems going through, so they went through and they literally, it's easier to see when I show you where the headboards and everything, they actually put a hinge in there. They went cut part of the wall between the headboard and the aisle next to the door frame so that it swung back. So you open the door and you peel back the wall, so you got an extra 4 inches or 8 inches of space to load in. And here's, as you can see, once again, just lining up where the doors are. But the picture on the right is the Joseph Lister before it's been worked on. They actually backed it out for me in August of 2019, so I can take a bunch of interior photos and things, and that's what it looked like. You can still see some of the original paint. It got converted into a carpenter shop car, if I remember right. It went in maintenance away service. They both did. I meant to check to find out the current status. It's been a couple years, but then with the COVID and that, I'm not sure if they actually got as much done as they wanted to. So here we are looking at special room D. So you see the headboard. The headboard's on the aisle, and then the mirrors behind the door, and then you can see the connecting door to bedroom E. And you can see in the little drawing on the lower left there that they line up straight into the special rooms, and then the attendant was intended to ride in the room next to it. I know it's almost impossible to read the drawing there, but down at the Illinois Railroad Museum, they do have all the plans. And so anyway, if you're looking at the picture on the right, there's a toilet there. This has got a fold-down sink. You can see it's down in the position there. You're looking at the foot of the bed where they got the suitcase and somebody's nightgown laid out there, and a copy of Vanity Fair and whatever. And so that's what they look like. The special rooms, the only difference between them, other than the heat pad and a few things like that, was the special rooms were originally built without the sink. They had the toilet, but not the sink. And then the companion room, the other bedroom, had the fold-down sink. And I guess the thought was, if they're in there in a stretcher, that they aren't going to be getting up to wash their hands and whatever. So anyway, this is looking down, and room C, the one on the right, where it says 3 1/4 inches wider, that's the special room. And then the companion's room is the one next to it. And so like I said, the doors are wider, and they all lined up straight across. And we're now looking at in the companion's room, looking and to the left is the special room. And so when they did that thing when I was mentioning about folding the wall back, they started with about the middle of the headboard, so about where the edge of the photo is, and they peeled the wall back that much farther. So, and they adjusted the door frame and everything, so basically you had a really wide opening. So, of course, they also handled not just stretcher people, but they were handling people, wheelchair patients. And the picture in the lower left is actually from a Time magazine article talking about Rochester and all the Mayo stuff in the 1930s. The guy on the right in the wheelchair is New Brockney, going up there for some treatments. And so what they needed to come up with is a better way to get wheelchair people on. And so they decided that the way the women's dressing room was built, it had 2 upholstered swivel chairs in front of a big mirror, dressing table area. And somebody said, well, when we have to load somebody in a wheelchair, we just use this wooden chair from inside the station, and 2 guys can pick it up and walk right through the vestibule door. No problem. And so somebody said, well, why don't we do something like that? And they said, yeah, let's make it out of aluminum. It'll be light, it'll be strong. And so what they did is they ended up, Pullman, I find this amazing, Pullman writes a letter to Alcoa and says, hi, we need 4 chairs. And sure enough, they came back with the design, and they came back and said, okay, sure, we'll sell them to you. I guess they wanted to keep the Northwestern as a customer, so yeah, Alcoa headquarters, sure, we can get you 4 chairs. And so they did that in addition to the stretchers. And here you can see the picture on the left, it shows the upholstered swivel chairs. And then they just put them in with 4 chairs that they paid $24 a piece for. And that was in the blind end of the car. You can see there's no vestibule doors down where the women's lab was. So this is one of those things that came up as part of the follow-on reports. They actually had, a month or so after they went into service, they had like the Pullman company surgeon, they had the VP of operations, they had people like this riding the train. And they would watch somebody getting loaded on a stretcher and then take notes and send them back to the engineering people. They said, okay, yeah, maybe we need to do something about loading them, make it easier. And because when those cars were built, there were no sill steps, there were no grab irons on those special doors, and which the railroad crews weren't too thrilled with, but they eventually got added. But also, they go, well, how are we going to get them into these special doors? They would put a baggage cart there. Well, then you got about 8 guys. You got to lift it to the cart, then you got to open the door, then you got to lift them into the thing, and then you got to walk through and get them out and everything. So they said, yeah, we need to do something like build a high-level platform at Rochester, just long enough for that one car, because there's only going to be one on each train. And other things, they said, maybe we need to add some rubber sheets to the linen inventory, because they're in stretchers, they aren't going to necessarily get up the toilet. They'd already ruined like 8 mattresses in the first 6 months or whatever because of problems with that. So, and then they were among the first ones converted to ICE air conditioning. So this is what they came up with. It was just a set of stairs with wheels on one end, pick it up, slide it up, bring it back. And it got it down where you only needed 2 people, just 2 guys to walk up the steps and then go straight into those special rooms. Now, it's one of those things that it's obvious here when you look at it, that car has always got to be running the same direction because the doors are only on one side. The other side is a normal sleeping car side. So basically it always had to run AN forward, is the way it turned out to be. And other stations, they would have to adapt. The only one that they built the steps for was Rochester. Of course, in like Union Station, or not Union Station, Northwestern Station in Chicago, you had higher platforms and stuff. So it wasn't as big an issue as it was at Rochester, where they were literally just loading on and off the dirt. And there's some pictures of it being done. There's 2 ambulance guys coming off. And then just wheel the gurney down the platform into the back of the ambulance. And so they like I said, were worried about, okay, we solved the problem, what are we going to do? And so they started doing a lot of reporting on things. So here's after they went into service June the 30th, so gave it about a month for break-in, and so now we're into the August, September, and so they started checking the numbers. So you got 31 trips each way, 1 north, one south, so 62 trips on the car. And there weren't a lot of passengers, and this is only the passengers for the special rooms, for those 4. And there were only 9 stretcher patients. And some could go through the vestibule door, some went through the side door, and then only 4 big ones through the side doors. So we did all this work to move 4 people. They checked again 6 months later, and sure enough, we only moved 7 people, and only 4 of them were on large stretchers for that month. But anyway, so the market never really developed like they thought it was going to. I mean, they made an effort, and they made a good effort, and they kept following up. So this is what happened to them. By 1958, they've come out of even the Chicago to Green Bay service. They've been withdrawn from the Pullman lease, and now they've been converted to maintenance away cars. This happens to be the Ephraim McDowell, which was scrapped, but they both ended up looking just about the same. The usual MOW kind of things, where extra vents cut in and some walls taken out, stuff like that. And there's the Lister getting ready to go in for its refurbishment. It's still got the roller bearing trucks underneath, which I was kind of surprised, but I guess there wasn't a real need for 6-wheel trucks maybe in '58. So now we got the next segment, the repurposing cars for dedicated service. And this is going to get into the polio patients. And so this is the San Lucas, it was called, Pullman Plan 2635. Because originally there were 2 cars built in this plant, and 2 cars only. The Lake Geneva and the Lake Forest, and they were built for the Northwestern Limited to go to Twin Cities from Chicago. 7 compartment lounge. So they were not something that you could use on every run. So I see enough people that have hair the color of mine that we kind of remember when polio was a real thing, you know. I mean, I was 5, 6 years old before we could get polio shots, you know, and I got a cousin that was on crutches for his life from the time he was a little kid because he got polio and stuff. And so this is a little bit like some of the COVID numbers, but 95% of the people that they decided had polio never knew it. They would get headaches and they would get fevers and all that kind of stuff, but it didn't affect them. Then you had about 3 to 4% that had some kind of paralysis, lower body usually, like my cousin and Franklin Roosevelt, as far as that goes. And so they could get around on crutches or whatever. And then you got the 1% that had the spinal paralysis, and they could not operate their lungs. They could not breathe if they were not in that iron lung. And so what we now call the March of Dimes, it was set up the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis because this was normally a childhood disease. I mean, everybody that came down with it, usually, a few exceptions, Roosevelt didn't get it until he was in his 20s or 30s, but most everybody was young kids. And the numbers, in 2018, there were still 3 people in the US in iron lungs, and the most recent number I could find is I thought there was only 1 left as of 2020. And the problem is that there are no longer parts for these things. They haven't been made for 50 years. They're literally being patched together, the seals and belts and whatever. You need to know a guy who's good with his own machine shop if something happens. Because the ones that are still in it are the ones that, if they're out of it or it quits for 2 minutes, they're dead. I mean, it's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. So we'll kind of go through these a little bit. Here's the Ferdinand Magellan, as you might have guessed. And it was built as a Pullman rental car, private car rental. They had a fleet of 6 or 8 of them. And up until this was donated to the US government in 1942, if Calvin Coolidge or Taft or Hoover wanted to go on a trip, they just rented a car from Pullman. And they put it with some other sleeping cars for the press and the Secret Service, and they just took off and went. They just rented the car by the day. And so that's what this was. And then, of course, in 1942, with the war on, this one was picked out of the hat. AAR donated it to the US government and or sold it for $1, one or the other. And then they put in the shops, they put in 3-inch thick bulletproof glass, they armor plated it, top and bottom and sides, and it was configured for the president. Well, the thing they did for Roosevelt, because remember, he was on crutches, and what they used to have to do is carry a big long ramp, kind of like a wheelchair ramp. It was carried in a baggage car, and it took about 8 guys to carry it and move it back there, and he could get off. And then, of course, the press in those days never took pictures of it because they didn't want to advertise the fact that the president couldn't walk without help. So there's always a picture of like his son holding him by the arm. His son is actually holding him up, and he had, of course, the leg braces and everything like that. But in 42, they put in, as you can see in that left photo, there's a ramp, there's an elevator, only on that side of the platform. And you can see it in the right photo, it's up. So it just looks like a solid sheet of sheet metal, but it's basically a little small elevator that would fit him standing there on his crutches, not on a wheelchair necessarily, but just that. And then they took it off after he died. And actually, there it is. If you didn't know, that car still sits in the in Miami, in the museum. I was trying to think of the name. Gold Coast. That's right. I started to say Orange, but that's not right. Yeah, Gold Coast. And it's configured the way it was towards the end. Anyway, so iron lungs, quick refresher, it's what they call ventilators, like they were talking about getting built for the COVID and everything. It's vacuum cleaner, the initial ones. So it's, suck out, push in, suck out, push in, force your lungs to breathe. And so the first one came out in 1927. It was kind of a box with an airtight collar. I mean, they laid in there, and there was a leather collar that went around their neck, because they decided leather was better than rubber as far as skin problems and everything. And then a guy by the name of Emerson in 31 came up with a better one with a slide-out tray. So they load you on there, they could slide you in and out to change your clothes or do whatever they need to. But they still cost as much as the average house in America when they were built. And this is a picture of Vanderbilt Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee, and that's how common it was. This is about 1950. And if you look real close, there's some that are smaller than others, because they were kids, literally 3, 4 years old, something like that. And they're big. They got down there 6 foot by 3 foot by 4 foot plus. And you can see the little mirrors sticking up an angle over their heads. So if they wanted to see anything, they would look straight up and then they would see what's going on behind them. And in the sides, you can see that it looks like portholes or doors. That was to reach in to do anything. The nurses, and then there were seals around it. They could reach in with gloves or whatever, and they could adjust your things, whatever. So here's the San Lucas. And like I said, it was originally built for the Northwestern Limited. They replaced that train, changed the configuration and everything. So in 1924, Pullman reassigned it to the SP, changed the name, and eventually it was sold off for scrap in '56. So it was only 1 and 2, as I mentioned. It was never air conditioned, which was interesting. It was all compartments, so it'd be all higher priced rooms. So you wonder what the thing was, but there were no sections. So basically, if you didn't have a lot of rich people traveling, you couldn't fill the car. So it was probably a money loser, and that's why they owned it all too. And so why did they do that one? Well, if you look at the floor plan there, the door is not centered coming off the platform into the lounge section. It's off to the left side. And it had a big picture window. And the reason they could use this then for those iron lungs is they could pop out that window, take down part of the railing, and then loading through the window. If the door had been centered, you didn't have enough room. And so luckily, in the case of several people, these two things were just sitting there being unused by the SP. So we get into a man by the name of Fred Snike Jr., and he was pretty famous in the 40s, 50s, whatever. He used to be in newsreels. His family were bankers in Chicago, rich people, lived out in River Forest, owned a chain of banks across the country. His family donated the art museum at Notre Dame. They were big into a lot of things. Well, Fred Jr. is off touring around China, and he got sick in what was then called Peking. And it just happened to be he got sick there because that was the only hospital in the entire country of China that had an iron lung. Because John D. Rockefeller, mean robber baron he was, had donated one there. And it just happened to be there. It was a Methodist hospital or a missionary hospital. And so Snike's father bought his own iron lung, had it shipped to China, and then they loaded him in it. And from then on, he made multiple trips in the San Lucas. And here we see him coming off. The picture on the left is coming down the gangplank off of the SS Calvin Coolidge at San Francisco. And you can see it's an entourage of nurses, Chinese and American nurses. You can see some of the sailors in white hats helping carry him down. And basically they just had to put him down the gangplank. The one on the right is unloading him in Chicago. They put him on the Overland Limited, and when he got to Chicago, they cut that car off, put it to a loading dock kind of on the west side of Chicago, and then manhandled him off, because they hadn't really got down the loading and unloading sequence as well as they did years
They must
ago.
have had COVID back then too with those masks.
Well, polio, I mean, it was definitely contagious. So anyway, so San Lucas actually kind of becomes the de facto dedicated polio service car. It didn't have a regular use, and there it was. And so from 1937 to 54, it basically only handled Fred Snike. And a couple of odd examples other than that. He moved from Chicago to Miami every year, went down in the fall, came back in the spring, and his family bought all the ramps, the coolers, the spare motors, everything needed to transport it. Built their own trailer kind of thing, like I mentioned at the opening there, so that they could haul him around. They had a house in Minocqua. I mean, they would come up in the summer. He had his own bus, basically, and they would take him up there and things like that. So as far as the San Lucas, though, it just sat at the Calumet shops for 6 months at a time a lot of times, never moved until the family decided they wanted to change. So there were discussions at Pullman, basically by the time you get into the 50s, saying, hey, we're spending a lot of money to maintain this thing, and we don't even get back what it's costing to get it ready to go on the road before, do we really want to start charging the family for it? Because they haven't been charging them for it. It's the normal rail fares. They haven't been charging them for the upkeep on the car and getting it ready to roll. So, but they decided, well, public relations we're getting out of this are good, because the newsreels photos, you'd see the name Pullman on the side, and then you'd see them being loaded on and off the back. So they said, oh, we're not going to become the bad guys in the newspapers. We're just going to leave it alone for now. And so to get him moved, it'd be the family plus a doctor, at least one nurse, a respirator specialist, in other words, a guy that can keep the iron lung moving if it has a problem. 3 or 4 electricians and mechanics to load it and unload it, because you had to take the railings off, you had to take the windows out, you had to put those ramps in, you had to do all that kind of stuff. They modified the electrical system on the car. They added extra cables so they could train line to another car ahead in case the generators went out. They put in fresh 600 amp batteries before every trip. They carried a spare set of batteries for every trip. Also, on some of the other ones we'll get to, they would put in a small generator or whatever, or configure alternators and stuff. So anyway, the first trip, like I said, was San Francisco to Chicago after he came off the ship. And then normally he traveled on the Dixie Limited, the C&NI, L&N, NC and STL, ACL, you know, the normal Florida trains route to Miami. He also went from Miami to New York City, where he got on the SS Normandy and went to France because he wanted to go to Lourdes and get put in the water hoping for a miracle cure. There were some other times it was used, though, like I said, a few others. There were 3 girls that got taken from Vanderbilt Hospital in Nashville to their home in North Carolina for Christmas one year. So that was 560 miles. And basically just 3 girls on that whole car. And same kind of thing almost with moving Snike. And then the guy that had kind of the long distance record was a guy by the name of Clifford Edson. He moved from Los Angeles to North Philadelphia on the trip. So they had to deadhead the car, fix it up, then deadhead it all the way to LA, then all the way back to Philadelphia, and then deadhead it back. And all the time is carrying extra mechanics, electricians, supervisors, whatever. But anyway, they got a lot of positive publicity, and there they are. And you can see Fred's image up there. That's in the mirror. It's not his head sticking out. He eventually got a little better. He could be out of there for a few hours at a time. They had a portable respirator, I guess. It was like having it's like looking at the Tin Man in the Wizard of Oz. It kind of fit the square thing around him, and basically it gave enough to move him. So he actually, he was single when all this started. He actually got married and had 3 kids. You could be out of it for at least a couple minutes. And if you note at the bottom there, it kind of got chopped off, but if you look at the ramps, you can see that it's like a C channel, so that the wheels would roll in there. You didn't have to worry about it going off the edge when you're trying to load it and unload it. And so there we are, pushing them on. You can see a little bit better maybe, and same kind of picture. So this is one where they're going from Chicago to Miami. Everybody's got their coats on there, and then when they get to Miami, they can take them off. So to load that thing, though, so you got to go. He's sitting in his house in Illinois or in Florida, either one, and he's running on 110 AC. So you got to change from you literally pulled out the motor. You took out the AC motor, put on a DC motor, and you had to do that fast. Okay, so that's why the specialist was along. Then they would connect the DC motor on a big long extension cord into batteries that were in that trailer that was hauling them. Then you would drive to the railroad station. You would take the extension cord and hook it into the car power. So we run off the batteries on the San Lucas. Then you had to move him, put the railings down and all that kind of stuff, move him in. Then basically what they did was, to keep him from bouncing around, is they put big hunks of wood on the floor of that lounge end of the car. Then they put some sponge rubber on it. They bolted it down to the floor, and so that was acting as a little bit of shock absorbing, and just pressed on from there. And of course, when you get to the other end, the unloading is the reverse of that. So here's some of the numbers that I found in the Pullman correspondence. So 1949, and you got to remember in those days, the mechanic electrician was probably getting $1.25 to $1.50 an hour. So, you know, talking Pullman's cost $445, so that's a good bit. And then at Miami, it took an electrician and 4 mechanics to do it. Unloading in Chicago was 1 electrician and 3 mechanics, and I never did find the difference why. And like I said, as of 1950, he's been doing this for 13 years, and they've never billed him for the cost of any of this kind of prep charges and things like that. Now, the last trip he ever made in it, November 2nd of 54, it cost Pullman $1,600 to get it ready to roll, and they recovered $397. So it was a money loser from day one. Now, the Marks and Dimes was involved in this kind of stuff because they thought there was going to be this big demand for it, kind of like the Mayo and everybody on the structure patients, like we already talked about. So they started a big campaign, and so they wrote this letter that you can't read, but it's to the Trunk Line Central Passenger Committee. So back in the days when they had the different tariff boards and committees and stuff for the industry. And he basically is saying, yeah, we need more cars configured this way, and they need to have, you know, extra batteries, and they need to have standby generators, they need to have all this and that and the other. And, but it turned out it didn't really come out. There were very few passengers that really needed this kind of treatment other than Snike. By then they'd come up with better respirators. They had those portable ones, like I mentioned, that they could work for most people. And by 55, we're given vaccines. And by then also the government had authorized polio patients to be flown in Air Force transport planes, which happened on a level. Now, I mentioned about the girls going to Vanderbilt. This came out of the Milwaukee Road Employee magazine, February #55, and that talks about the girls that they're moving. Says a 560-mile trip that made railroad history and also medical history. And those girls one of them was on an iron lung, the other two were on the small portable respirators. But the car they're talking about that they used is the San Lucas. And they had to actually ship in technicians and spare respirators and stuff from New York, Philadelphia, Chicago to help out with moving this. And so basically, as near as I can tell, they would go Nashville down to Atlanta and then back up the southern to Charlotte or Asheville, wherever they were going. So now we've been handling all these things with basically, here's some old equipment, let's make it work, or in the case of the Lister and the McDowell, you know, designing one, but they only build a few. So somebody decided, well, let's make a standardized approach. Let's put it in every car we're making so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And here's, of course, a picture of the Milwaukee observation. And the aluminum framed one that sticks out in the window band is the swing up hinged sill, I guess is the official term, window. It goes into a bedroom. And so they thought they had the right idea, and it was originally something the Pensy wanted. They considered this to be an emergency escape. It had a lot of problems with that, because first off, it swung up inwards, it didn't swing out, and so they wanted to install it, and the Pullman manufacturing side equipment committee said, this is a dumb idea, this isn't going to work, it doesn't have much clearance, you know, we think we shouldn't build these cars this way. But the president overruled him and says, no, I think it might be of some use and it's good public relations, so build them anyway. If the railroad wants it, we'll put it in there. And so the problem was that the seal was tricky. It took time to do it, obviously. It took two mechanics to do it, which became a problem because if you didn't do it at an endpoint that had a shop crew, if you're in Baraboo, you know, there's not a lot of guys standing around to replace windows, you know, and and there was also only about this much clearance when that window was up, because it went up against the roof, but not all the way, and you know, it just didn't work out real good. So eventually they decided that rather than messing with the hinge sill windows, we'll just pull out a fixed window, because it was faster. You just undid the screws, pulled it out, put it back. So we're now back to the 1870s solution. And this one, I know it's hard to read, but it's a 1958 telegram from the Union Pacific to Pullman Company. And basically they're saying, we have another request to handle, in this case, a heart patient that requires window loading and electric suction pump converter. In other words, it's got to have something running. On train 17 from Kansas City, May 15th, through to Tacoma. We feel there's too much risk in handling this patient, and you guys didn't ask us in advance to do this. And so in the future, you need prior approval before you sell a ticket on this thing. Because the problem was the train got into Portland, and then normally what you would do is the sleeper didn't go through to Seattle. They transferred first-class passengers to the parlor car. Well, they didn't have enough time to make a connection, so they ended up running this 664 sleeper all the way up to Seattle, turned around and brought it back, all for one guy laying in the bed. You know, and they go, yeah, this isn't probably the best way to do things. Now, today, because 1990 we had the Americans with Disability Act, so you know now we have wheelchair wraps required and all that kind of stuff. So Amtrak and the Superliners and newer built handicap rooms. The problem with that is If you ask Julie, your virtual assistant, which Naomi did, she said, how many passengers with medical needs like being on a stretcher are accommodated every year? And Julie says, unfortunately, we are not able to accommodate customers traveling on stretchers or gurneys. Please contact us with any questions. So basically, we're back to, if you're on a stretcher patient kind of thing, you're going air ambulance or ground ambulance, but you're not going on the train. And if you look at some of the dimensions on the plans, the Amtrak handicap room on the ground floor of those double-deck superliners or whatever, yeah, you can get through there, but you almost need the skinny wheelchair like they use on airlines to get down the aisle, because you can't clear the big motorized ones through the door frame, assuming you can even make it up the, the difference between whatever platform you're at and that. So, and the railroads, I mean, they've been discouraging this. Like I mentioned, the thing about the UP, the California Zephyr, their thing in that same mid-50s thing was, okay, we'll take them, but you have to be at the Oakland Pier, 2 hours ahead of time. You got to book it a week ahead of time. You got to have, everything there, your documentation, which actually Amtrak requires documentation if you're going to use the handicap room. And then we will only accept stretcher patients at Oakland or at Chicago. Nobody in between, because they wanted to have the mechanics and everything around to do it. So it didn't help a whole lot. So anyway, same thing as I said before, if you run into any files that talk about, moving these kinds of things, and there are other ones, the Western Pacific built a whole car during the Korean War to do nothing but blood drives. Went around the system and collected blood from every little section hand shack or whatever. And so that was kind of interesting. So this kind of stuff dealing with patients work.
I have a question.
Sir.
All right, I'm moving that San Luis car with that Fred Emerson on the Santa Fe, and then the PRR, the Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia. All right, now the Santa Fe comes into Dearborn Station, but Pennsylvania
was Union
goes
Station.
out of Union Station. So how do they transfer the car? They didn't take the patient out. They had to use the same car. How do they transfer that car from the Santa Fe to the PRR?
They cut it off and moved it to a switcher. But yeah, they would go back on the car batteries. I guess if that's what you're saying. They didn't unload the patient. They left everybody in there.
Yeah, they had to use the same car.
Yeah, they kept the same car, and they just cut it off, and the switcher moved it from one to the other, just like they transfer anything else.
Yeah, pull it out of the station, and when there was a connection, maybe, the Santa Fe's courtyard was 18th Street, or the Pennsylvania's was.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they actually took it all the way to the station, or if they cut off some of the other trackage around Chicago. There's no problem then, but yeah, they did it as a switching move. Yeah.
They both came in different stations.
Yeah, you can do it. So anyway, if you got any other questions, I guess I'll try to answer this one. Yeah.
You mentioned that there were 3 iron lungs still in use in 2018. Were those consistently in use with one patient?
Yes.
So somebody was stuck in that thing for 40 years or more?
Yes. I read one biography of a woman that had been in one for 60-some years. And I'm not sure if she's the one who's still alive or not, but yeah, she contracted it as a child in North Carolina, and she was 80-something years old and still in it. Yeah. Yeah. Whole life in iron lung, yeah, you're right. And I mean, she was one that luckily she could be out for, not just 2 minutes, but she could be out for like 30 minutes, 40 minutes, whatever. So yeah, they get out, you get a sponge bath, change your clothes, wear bedpan, that kind of thing. But yeah, she could not live without it. Yeah, and she had to have constant attendant. And like I said, because you had to make your own parts at this point, and there hadn't been parts built for these things since about 1960 or something. That you literally had to have a guy that, it's kind of like go out in the barn and I need a belt that's about this long kind of mentality. So yeah, that's true. Yes, sir.
For those of us with close at hand, Joseph Lister was unveiled on April 21st, completely restored.
Okay, I hadn't checked, and I knew it should have been done. Actually, it should have been done originally like a year ago, but I knew they got.
Yeah, they said it took them 2.5 years, but
yeah.
The 21st was.
Oh, that's good, because I didn't have time on this trip to go by Green Bay, because I thought about that. Yeah, thank you. Sir.
The patient rooms didn't look like there was room enough, say, to accommodate a gurney. But whatever the patient got wheeled in on, did they have like a baggage compartment, or would they just stay right on their stretcher? Or?
Stayed on the stretcher.
Yeah, I got you.
Yeah, and so yeah. Anybody else? That's Spot Shot.